The snow fell so fast it was like the sky was coming apart. 1 minute, the train station was a building. The next, it was an island in a sea of white. The world was gone. The train was gone. All that was left was the scream of the wind and a woman standing alone on the platform. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 50 years old, and the world had told her she was finished. Her own family had promised to meet her, but the train smoke vanished, and so did that promise. They weren't coming. They had chosen absence over duty. Shame was a rock in her chest. Through the depot window she could see them whispering. Elsie May, the widow who ran the place. Sheriff Amos Grady, leaning against the stove like a vulture waiting for something to die. Their faces were pinched with judgment. They looked at her size, at the silver in her hair, and they saw a fool, an abandoned parcel nobody wanted to claim. She wouldn't go inside. She wouldn't let them see her beg for warmth. Pride was the only thing she had left, and it was a threadbare coat against a blizzard. If she was going to freeze, she'd do it standing up. Then the wind changed, and a shape came out of the white. It wasn't a man. It was a piece of the storm given flesh. The door to the depot slammed shut, the whispers retreating into the warmth. They were leaving her to her fate. The figure grew closer, taller, broader than any man had a right to be. He moved like the blizzard bent to his will. He emerged from the snow, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Chenoa, the Apache. Every soul in town knew his name. Savage, they called him. Untamed. A man who answered insults with a silence colder than steel. He was shirtless in the freezing gale, a buffalo hide slung over one shoulder. His chest was a road map of scars, his hair black as a raven's wing. His eyes burned. He didn't even glance at the faces pressed against the depot glass. His gaze landed on her. And in that moment, the whole world went quiet. The storm held its breath. He stopped right in front of her. He looked at her trunk. He looked at the lines the world had carved into her face. She braced for the usual cruelty, the smirk men save for women they've deemed worthless. But his eyes held none of that. They just watched her, like a man watches a mountain. "You're coming with me," he said. His voice was the sound of rocks grinding in a riverbed. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Her mind reeled. Who was this man? Why? But the words were tangled with shame in her throat. To stay here was to drown in humiliation. To go with him was to step into a terror she couldn't name. What would you do? Stay and face the whispers, or walk into the storm with a stranger? Before she could answer, he bent down. He lifted her heavy trunk with one hand like it was a bundle of sticks, and then he lifted her. He swept her off her feet, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She gasped, her hand flying to his shoulder. She felt the shocking heat of his skin through her thin glove. The raw power in him was terrifying. But he didn't carry her like a prize. He carried her like something he had already decided was his. The depot door burst open. "You can't just—" Elsie May's shriek was cut short by the wind. Sheriff Amos was right behind her, his hand on the butt of his pistol. "Put her down, Apache." Chenoa didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He just turned his head, the snow catching in his dark lashes, and looked at the sheriff. His silence was more of a threat than any gun. Amos Grady froze on the steps. He was a man who knew how to measure a fight, and he knew this was one he couldn't win. Eleanor was caught between two worlds, the burning humiliation of being carried like helpless cargo in front of the whole town, and beneath it, a tiny, forgotten spark, the thrill of being chosen, the shock of being seen by someone when she thought she had become invisible. The storm swallowed them whole. The last thing she saw was that cluster of faces, pale and judging, pressed against the glass. Then they were gone. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Where was he taking her? What did he want? The questions were sharp knives in her mind, but she couldn't speak. She could only feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the impossible strength in the arm that held her. For the first time in so many years, she wasn't alone in the storm. When the last light from the station finally died, leaving them in a roaring, white darkness, a new truth chilled her deeper than the snow. She had been taken without her consent, carried off into a fate she did not choose. And yet, her fingers tightened on his shoulder. She didn't want him to let go. The blizzard tried to tear them apart, but Chenoa walked on as if the wind itself was afraid of him. Eleanor clung to him, her world reduced to the blur of white, the howling gale, and the solid, rhythmic power of his stride. She didn't know how long they walked. Time had dissolved into the storm. Then, a shape emerged from the swirling snow. A cabin, rough logs dark against the white, a crooked chimney breathing a thin line of smoke. It looked like a fist raised against the storm. It looked like survival. He set her down on the threshold, not gently but not unkindly either, just factually. He pushed the door open, and the warmth that rushed out hit her like a physical blow. The smell of wood smoke and pine and something else, something wild, like dried sage. She stumbled inside, half blind from the snow. The cabin was a single room, long and narrow, with a sleeping loft above. A fire roared in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The place was filled with the tools of a life lived alone. Hides, weapons, bundles of herbs. It was a space built for one man, and yet it felt like it was waiting. Chenoa slammed the door, and the roar of the storm was gone. The silence that fell was deafening. There was only the crackle of the fire. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, ashamed of the puddle of melted snow forming at her feet. He didn't say a word. He dropped her trunk by the wall and crossed to the hearth. He added more logs, and the fire leaped up, throwing heat and light into the room. He took a quilt from a shelf, the stitching was uneven but strong, and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, shocked by the gesture, but he had already turned away. She sat on a small stool, clutching the quilt. It smelled of smoke and earth and winters. She tried to find her voice, to ask the 1,000 questions screaming in her mind, but her tongue was a clumsy, frozen thing. He moved around the cabin with a quiet purpose, filling a kettle, hanging it over the flames. He acted as if she'd always been there, as if her sudden appearance required no explanation at all. What must he see when he looked at her? A useless, cast-off woman shivering by his fire, a burden. Her hands trembled as she pulled the quilt tighter. It slipped, and he noticed. Without looking up from the fire, he reached over and laid another blanket within her reach. It wasn't pity. It was a gesture as simple as adding wood to a fire. And that simple, practical act pierced her shame more deeply than any kindness could have. Finally, he spoke. "You were alone." The words filled the small cabin. She fumbled for a reply. "My kin, they didn't come." He nodded once, not with surprise, with certainty, as if he already knew. He poured steaming water into a tin cup, added some dried leaves from a pouch, and handed it to her. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt of warmth shot through her, faster and hotter than the tea. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was a living thing, filled with the firelight and the shadows and all the things they weren't saying. Eleanor sipped the tea, her eyes wandering around the room. It was a place of solitude, yes. A bedroll folded with military precision, a hunting bow polished smooth with use. But then she saw it, a detail that didn't fit. There was a second chair at the small wooden table, and one of the shelves on the wall had been cleared, as if waiting for someone's things. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in her stomach. Had he been expecting someone? Was she just a replacement? The storm rattled the shutters and she flinched. He glanced at the window, then back at her. His face was a mask she couldn't read. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, the apology sharp in her own ears. "The town will talk." For the first time, his eyes locked on hers. They were as steady as the mountains. "Let them talk." The words hit her like a torch in a dark room. No man had ever defended her like that, not without wanting something, not without a hidden cruelty. She turned her face away, hiding the sudden sting of tears. He rose and barred the door against the storm. She watched the firelight play across the scars on his back. This man was made of struggle. As the night wore on, he placed bread and dried meat on the table. He didn't serve her. He just made it available. Hunger won out over her pride, and she ate, feeling his eyes on her. But when she dared to look up, he wasn't watching her with scorn. He was whittling a small piece of wood, his focus absolute. A dangerous thought crept into her mind. Maybe she wasn't just an object of pity. Maybe, in some way she couldn't understand, she was wanted here. But the doubt came crashing back. What could a man like him possibly want with a woman like her? The wind howled, and the cabin seemed to shiver with it. Chenoa looked up from his work, his eyes catching the firelight. The carving in his hand was nearly finished. He set it on the table closer to her side. It was a bird. Its wings were outstretched, ready for flight. Her breath hitched. She reached for it, then pulled her hand back, afraid. What did it mean? Was he telling her she was free to go, or was it something else entirely? She looked up at him, and in his gaze she saw no command, no judgment, only that same, steady, unhurried waiting. And in that moment, she knew. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. But she was wrong. She thought the greatest change had already happened. She had no idea what was waiting for her in the dark. While Chenoa slept, a deep, still sleep by the hearth, Eleanor couldn't rest. The image of the carved bird, the empty shelf, the second chair, it was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her fear had subsided, replaced by a gnawing curiosity that was almost as painful. Why her? Why this cabin? Her gaze fell on her trunk. It held all she had left in the world. Worn dresses, a few books, the physical proof of a life of being unwanted. But there was something else inside. Something she hadn't looked at in years. A secret buried under shame. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she rose silently from her pallet. The floorboards were cold under her bare feet. She knelt before the trunk, her fingers fumbling with the frozen latch. It creaked open, loud in the sleeping cabin. She froze, watching Chenoa. He didn't stir. She pushed aside the layers of clothes, her hands searching for the false bottom her father had built so long ago. Her fingers found the catch. The panel lifted. Inside wasn't jewelry or money. It was a bundle of papers, tied with a faded ribbon, legal documents. With trembling hands, she lifted them out. The firelight was just enough to read by. It was a deed to 100 acres of timberland in this very valley. The land her father had left her, the one thing that was supposed to be hers alone. Her brother, in his letters, had told her it was worthless, that it had been sold off to pay debts years ago. He had lied. But that wasn't the twist. She kept reading, her blood turning to ice. The deed came with a contract attached. A contract of sale, signed just 2 weeks ago by her brother. He had sold her land. He had sold it to a man named Silas Blackwood, a name she'd heard whispered in the depot. The man who owned the freight company, the saloon, everything. And the final soul-crushing detail was a note scribbled in the margin. The sale was conditional. It would only be finalized upon the delivery of the original deed holder, Eleanor herself, to the territory, where she would sign it away. Her family hadn't abandoned her at the station. They had shipped her here like cattle to be sold along with her land. They weren't just absent. They were monstrous. And then she saw the map, a small hand-drawn map tucked inside the deed. It showed the 100-acre plot. Right in the center of it, marked with a small X, was a cabin. This cabin. The air left her lungs in a silent scream. He hadn't rescued her. He was working for Blackwood. The empty shelf, the second chair. They were waiting for the new owner. Chenoa was just the hired help, sent to collect the parcel. The kindness, the quilt, the tea, it was all a lie. A way to keep the goods from freezing before they could be delivered. The carved bird on the table seemed to mock her, a symbol of a freedom she was never meant to have. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight, sharp and cold, cut through the window. She had sat by the dying fire all night, the deed clutched in her hand, her heart a dead, frozen thing in her chest. When Chenoa came in from splitting wood, she was waiting for him. She didn't speak. She just held out the papers. He looked at them, then at her face. His expression didn't change. He took the deed from her hand, his eyes scanning the page. She watched him, waiting for the lie, for the mask to drop. He read it. He looked at the map, then he did something she never expected. He walked to the far wall of the cabin, the papers still in his hand. He pointed to the rough-hewn logs. At first, she saw nothing, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw them. Carvings. Dozens of small, intricate carvings etched directly into the wood of the walls. They weren't random. They told a story of a people who had lived on this land for generations, a story of a family, a story of an attack, men on horses with rifles, a cabin burning, small figures lying in the snow. His family, murdered, on this land, by men with the brand of the Blackwood Freight Company on their saddles. He hadn't been sent by Blackwood. He was waiting for him. My grandfather told of a prophecy, he said, his voice low and rough. He said Blackwood's greed would one day deliver the weapon of his own undoing. It would come with the first great storm of the winter. It would be carried by a woman of silver and sorrow. He looked at her silver hair, at the tear tracks on her cheeks. The deed is the weapon. You are the woman. The world tilted on its axis. He hadn't seen a burden at the station. He had seen a prophecy fulfilled. He wasn't her jailer. He was her ally. The carved bird wasn't a mockery. It was a symbol from the stories on the wall, a symbol of a spirit that could not be broken. This wasn't about pity. It wasn't about land. It was about vengeance. And the storm had just delivered the key. The sound of hoofbeats came at noon, faint, but getting closer. Eleanor's heart, which had just begun to thaw, seized up again. It was Sheriff Amos Grady, his horse kicking up clouds of fresh snow. He didn't dismount. He just sat there in his saddle, his face hard. Blackwood knows you're here, Chenoa. He sent me to deliver a message. That woman doesn't belong to you, and that land doesn't belong to either of you. Chenoa stood by the woodpile, axe in hand, saying nothing. His silence was a wall. He wants the deed, and he wants the woman, the sheriff continued, his voice tight. He'll have them both by nightfall, one way or another. He turned his horse and rode off, the threat hanging in the cold, clean air. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin, the deed clutched in her hand. It was one thing to be a prophecy. It was another to be standing in the path of a man like Silas Blackwood. She looked at Chenoa. He'll kill us. He will try, Chenoa said. He walked back to the cabin, but he didn't look at the deed. He looked at her. The prophecy did not say the woman would be a warrior. I'm not, she said, her voice a broken whisper. I'm old and tired. All I've ever done is run. He reached out and took a strand of her silver hair between his rough fingers. They mock you for this, he said. It wasn't a question. They say you are finished. She could only nod, the shame of it hot on her cheeks. In response, he went to a shelf and took down a small object. He pressed it into her hand. It was a comb, newly carved from the same light wood as the bird. Etched into its spine was another bird, its wings spread wide, a gift, an offering, a choice. Her breath hitched. For years she had been passed from one family member to another, an obligation, a burden. Now this man, this stranger bound to her by fate, was offering her what? A place? A purpose? Here, he said, his voice carrying the weight of the mountains around them. You stay. A tear slid down her cheek. She took the comb. In that moment, touching the smooth carved wood, she made a choice. She would not run. Not this time. Just as the sun began to dip below the pines, a small figure appeared running through the snow. It was Tommy Lee, the stable boy from town. He was breathless, his face pale with fear. I heard 'em, he gasped, holding out a small bundle of bread. Mr. Blackwood and the sheriff. They ain't just comin' for the deed. They're sayin' he kidnapped you, Miss Whitfield. They're usin' it as an excuse. They're bringing a dozen men with rifles. They aim to see you a widow before you're even a wife. The boy's words hung in the air. A dozen men. Against one. Chenoa took the bread and nodded to the boy, who vanished back into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. Eleanor looked at Chenoa, her newfound courage crumbling into dust. What do we do? He didn't answer. He turned and went back inside the cabin. She followed, her heart pounding a funeral drum against her ribs. He wasn't gathering weapons. He wasn't barring the door. He was laying a strip of red cloth on the table. He was arranging bundles of sage and lighting them, the fragrant smoke curling up to the rafters. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling. The air was thick with smoke and tension. He looked at her, his dark eyes steady as stone. Union. The word hit her like a physical blow. Union. Marriage. It was insane. She was 50 years old, worn down by a life of disappointment. He was a warrior, a man who seemed carved from the land itself. You can't, she started, the absurdity of it bubbling up as hysterical laughter. I am too old. I am not what a wife should be. You are here, he said, as if that was the only truth that mattered. He stepped closer, the firelight casting shadows across his scarred chest. He picked up the red cloth. Apache way, he said. No preacher, no lawman. The wind is the witness. The fire is the bond. She thought of the town, Elsie May's vicious tongue, the men who would call her a disgrace. Joining herself to this man would be the final, unforgivable sin in their eyes. It would make her an outcast forever. It would also make her his, in the eyes of his tradition. It would bind her to him and him to her. It was a pact, an alliance. He held the cloth out to her. His hand was perfectly steady. She looked at his hand. She looked at the fire. She thought of a lifetime of being cast aside. She thought of a dozen men with rifles coming to kill this man who saw not a burden, but a prophecy. Her hand trembled as she rose. She stepped toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He took her wrist and gently tied one end of the red cloth around it. Then he tied the other end to his own. Their hands were joined. The cloth was like a vein of fire connecting them. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. He spoke then, in his own language, words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning she felt in the marrow of her bones. They were words of promise, of endurance, of belonging. When he finished, the cabin was silent, except for the crackling fire. He looked at her, waiting. The choice was hers. Yes, she whispered. The word was a key, unlocking something deep inside her. The years of shame and silence fell away. He pressed his forehead to hers. And in that moment, bound by firelight and red cloth, she was no longer an abandoned parcel. She was a fortress. But the enemy was at the gate, and the sun had almost set. The union wasn't an escape. It was a declaration of war. As soon as the word yes left her lips, the stillness in the cabin shattered. Chenoa dropped his forehead from hers and untied the cloth with a single sharp tug. He folded it once and placed it on the table, on top of the deed. A symbol. The land and the people were now one. "They will come from the east," he said, his voice stripped of all ceremony. "The trees are thinnest there. They will think we are trapped." He moved to a loose floorboard near the hearth. He lifted it, revealing a hidden cache beneath. He pulled out a Winchester rifle, its barrel gleaming in the firelight. Then another, and boxes of cartridges. He wasn't just a man with an axe. He was a soldier defending his home. He handed one of the rifles to her. It was heavy, alien in her hands. "I can't," she stammered. "I've never fired a gun." "You will not fire," he said. "You will load." He showed her how, his movements quick and precise. "When one is empty, you will hand me the other." His faith in her was terrifying. He wasn't asking her to be a warrior. He was asking her to be his partner. While he secured the cabin, checking the shutters, barring the door, Eleanor's mind raced. They couldn't win. 12 men against 2 in a tiny wooden box. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. Running was not an option, but fighting seemed like suicide. Then her eyes fell on the deed. The weapon, he'd called it. She had been reading it as a story of betrayal. But what if it was also a map to survival? She snatched the papers from the table, her eyes scanning the dense legal text, the surveyor's notes, the addendums her father had insisted upon. Her father had been a meticulous man, a man of details. And Silas Blackwood, for all his power, was a man of greed. Greedy men make mistakes. She found it. Tucked away in a clause about mineral rights, a boundary dispute. The original survey of the valley, done 30 years ago, was flawed. A creek that marked the eastern boundary had shifted its course after a flood. According to her father's resurvey, which was legally registered with the territorial office and attached to this very deed, the 10 acres of thin trees where Blackwood's men would approach didn't actually belong to Blackwood at all. They belonged to the reservation. It was Apache land. Blackwood wasn't just coming to enforce a fraudulent sale. He was about to lead an armed party in an illegal invasion of sovereign territory. It was a federal crime. "Chenoa," she said, her voice shaking with the discovery. "They aren't just coming for us. They're breaking their own treaty." He stopped, rifle in hand, and looked at her. A flicker of something, not surprise but respect, showed in his eyes. He understood immediately. This changed everything. It was no longer a personal fight. It was a legal one. But the law was miles away. Blackwood's men were only minutes. From outside, a voice called out, cutting through the twilight. It was Sheriff Grady. "Chenoa, Blackwood wants to talk. Come out with your hands empty." Chenoa glanced at Eleanor. He didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked to the hearth. He reached into the fire with his bare hand and pulled out a glowing ember. He placed it in a small bowl with a bundle of dried leaves. A thick, pungent smoke began to rise. He carried it to the chimney, opened the flue, and held the bowl up. The smoke was pulled from the cabin, rising into the darkening sky. A signal. "They cannot see it in the dark," Eleanor said, confused. "They will smell it," Chenoa replied. "They will come." Who was they? She had no time to ask. The shouting started again, this time from Blackwood himself. His voice was slick with arrogance and impatience. "I gave you a chance, Savage. You have 1 minute to send out the woman and the deed, or we're coming in." Chenoa took his position by the window, the Winchester resting on the sill. Eleanor knelt on the floor beside him, the second rifle loaded and ready, her heart hammering against her ribs. The smell of the signal smoke and gunpowder filled the small cabin. The minute was up. The first shot shattered the night. The window exploded inwards, showering them with glass and frozen wood. Eleanor screamed, dropping flat to the floor as another bullet punched through the wall right where her head had been. The air filled with the roar of rifles. Splinters flew from the walls. The cabin, their only shelter, was being torn apart around them. Chenoa didn't flinch. He was a statue of lethal calm. He didn't fire wildly. He waited, He watched, he aimed, he fired one shot. A scream from the darkness outside told her it had found its mark. "The other one?" he said, his voice level. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely work the mechanism. She shoved the loaded rifle into his hands and took the empty one, fumbling with the cartridges. Her fingers were slick with sweat despite the cold. She was clumsy. She was slow. Another volley of shots ripped through the cabin. The lantern on the table shattered, plunging them into near darkness, lit only by the flickering firelight and the muzzle flashes from outside. "They're moving to the door," Chenoa said. He left the window and flattened himself against the wall beside the heavy wooden door. He held the axe now, its polished head gleaming. Eleanor could hear them outside. Men shouting, cursing, the crunch of boots in the snow. They were getting ready to rush the cabin. This was it. They were going to die. Her entire life, a journey from one abandonment to another, was going to end here, in blood and fire, on a piece of land she never even knew was hers. The door shuddered as a heavy log smashed against it. Then again. The wood groaned, splitting. On the third strike, the bar shattered. The door flew open. A man stood silhouetted against the snow, rifle raised. Before he could fire, Chenoa moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a blur of motion, a force of nature. The axe swung in a silent, deadly arc. The man fell without a sound. Two more men tried to charge through the opening. Chenoa met them with the butt of the rifle, a whirlwind of controlled violence. But there were too many. They were pouring in. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. A high, piercing cry from the woods behind the cabin. A war cry. It was answered by another, and another. The men in the doorway froze, their heads whipped around, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear. From the darkness of the pines, figures emerged. Silent, swift. They were armed with bows and rifles, at least 20 of them. Chenoa's signal had been answered. Blackwood's men, caught between the cabin and the trees, between the lone warrior and the war party that had materialized from the night, threw down their guns. It was over. Silas Blackwood stood in the snow, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Sheriff Grady was beside him, his pistol still in his holster, his expression unreadable. Chenoa stepped out of the cabin. He wasn't breathing heavily. He wasn't even sweating. He stood over the body of the man he had killed and looked at Blackwood. "This is Apache land," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the snow like thunder. Eleanor followed him out, her legs unsteady. She held the deed in her hand, no longer just a piece of paper, but a weapon that had won a war. She walked to stand beside Chenoa before the eyes of Blackwood, the sheriff, and the silent warriors who had come to their aid. "The treaty is broken, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Mr. Blackwood has led an armed invasion. That's a federal crime." Amos Grady looked at her. He looked at the deed in her hand, at the dead man in the snow, at the dozen terrified men with their hands in the air. He looked at Chenoa, who stood beside this 50-year-old woman as if she were a queen. This wasn't about a land dispute anymore. This was a reckoning. The sheriff slowly drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at Chenoa. He pointed it at Silas Blackwood. "Silas," he said, his voice thick with a disgust that seemed years in the making. "You're under arrest." Justice hadn't come from a gun or an axe. It had come from a piece of paper in the hands of a woman everyone had dismissed as worthless. The aftermath was a quiet, frozen tableau. Blackwood and his men were disarmed, their hands bound by the warriors who had appeared from the forest. Sheriff Grady, looking like a man who had finally chosen a side after a lifetime on the fence, began the long process of marching them back to town. He paused before he left. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, she saw not the lawman, but the cousin who had failed to show up at the station. There was a deep, profound shame in his eyes. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect she never thought she would see, and then he was gone. The warriors melted back into the trees as silently as they had come, leaving Eleanor and Chenoa alone in the snow, outside their broken, bullet-riddled cabin. The body of the man Blackwood had sent to his death was carried away. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the pines and the crackle of the fire from inside. She was trembling, the adrenaline fading, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its place. She had stood her ground. She hadn't run. Chenoa reached out, and his hand gently covered hers, which was still clutching the deed. He didn't pull her close or say a word. He just stood with her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall against the cold and the dark. His touch was an anchor. Together, they turned and walked back into the cabin. They barred the shattered door as best they could, and added logs to the fire until it blazed, chasing the ghosts of violence from the corners of the room. Eleanor smoothed out the deed and placed it on the table. Chenoa took the red strip of cloth, the symbol of their union, and laid it across the paper. The land, the law, and their bond were now intertwined, inseparable. She looked around the small room. The scars on the walls were no longer just from age. They were battle scars. This wasn't just his home anymore. It was theirs. A place they had defended together. A place they had earned. She looked at him, truly looked at him, across the hearth. The firelight danced in his dark eyes. The silence that had once been so full of questions was now filled with a shared understanding that went deeper than words. He hadn't rescued a victim from a storm. He had found his ally, and she hadn't been carried off by a savage. She had found the one place in the world she truly belonged. The whispers in the town would not end. The world outside would continue to judge. But for the first time in her 50 years, Eleanor Whitfield didn't care. She was no longer a cast-off, no longer a burden, no longer invisible. She was a woman of silver and sorrow who had found her strength. She had been chosen by fate, and she, in turn, had chosen to fight. She had survived. She had won. She was home. What do you think is the true meaning of strength? Is it the power to fight, or the courage to stand your ground when everyone has counted you out? If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales that remind us that it's never too late to find out who you were meant to be.